The first step to understanding how we went from ancient times to modern times is to understand the development of feudalism in Western Europe. Feudalism is the system of society, how society was organized. It is very, very different from what we understand today, but it sets the basis of a lot of what we call class division, of why there are some people who are rich and why there are some people who are poor. And in some countries in Europe today, there's still a lot of division, and people who are rich stay rich, and people who are poor stay poor. And the reasons are born in feudalism. So we're talking specifically about feudalism in Western Europe. That's the western half of the European continent. Um, Feudalism existed in other countries, of course, in other Eastern Europe and Asia, but it was slightly different. And so we are focused on Western Europe, and we'll talk about feudalism in other countries in other chapters. So Western Europe, how did it go from once the Roman Empire dissolved? Remember, the Roman Empire fell apart, and the western half lasted until 476. They were destroyed by barbarians. Barbarians were basically people who were not Romans, and they were kind of the ancestors of the European people we think of today. They The Greeks called them barbarians because anyone who wasn't Greek they called a barbarian, because when they listened to them, they when they couldn't speak Greek, the Greeks thought that anything they said just sounded like gibberish, right? Because when you hear somebody who doesn't speak the same language as you, and there were words that just sounded to the Greeks like they were just saying bar 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 bar. So they called them barbarians. Anyway, the barbarians began to invade Western Europe, as we looked at in the last chapter, and they conquered territory and they set up their own kingdoms. The Franks conquered what we today call France. The the Burgundians, the Vandals, they all took over different parts of all over Europe. So the Franks are right over here. Oops. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, they all invaded and they all took over different parts of the country. The the leader of one of the Franks, though, okay, became the modern country of France, was a guy named Clovis, and Clovis was significant because he was the one who defeated the last great Roman army. Right? He defeated the last of the Roman legions, which really um, set up the Roman the end, which was really the real end of the Roman Empire. When you lose your army, then it's just a matter of time before everything else is gone. So Clovis was the leader of the Franks, and he uh, conquered all of what the Romans called Gaul, and he not only that, he also uh, helped convert the Franks into Christianity. Christianity, of course, the was the religion uh, of the Roman Empire, and remember that Constantine had converted everyone to Christianity, and it soon became it was the dominant religion of of Western Europe. And now, just a sidebar for those who are Christians, to understand what we're talking about with Christians here. I'm not talking about specifically about any theology or religion, but we are talking about the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church was pretty much the only church in Western Europe at that time. If you were a Christian, you were part of the Roman Catholic Church. If you weren't, then you were kicked out and you were called what they called a heretic. So let's talk about how Clovis became a Christian. All right, so here you can there's books back then. The church historian Gregory of Tours, that's the guy's name. He wrote his book. He lived about the year 539 to 594, and he wrote a book, The History of the Franks, and all this had happened about 50 years before. And so here's the story that Gregory of Tours tells of Clovis. Clovis took to wife Clotilde, daughter of the king of the Burgundians, and a Christian. The queen unceasingly urged the king to acknowledge the true God and forsake idols, but he could not in any wise be brought to believe until war broke out with the Alemanni. The two armies were in battle, and there was great slaughter. Clovis's army was near to utter destruction. He saw the danger, and raised his eyes to heaven, saying, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde declares to be the Son of the living God, who it is said, give us aid to the oppressed, and victory to those who put their hopes in thee. I beseech thy aid. If thou shalt grant me victory over thine enemies, I will believe in thee, and shall be baptized in thy name. For I have been called upon my gods, but they are far removed from my aid. So I believe that they have no power, for they do not succor those who serve them. Now I call upon thee, and I long to believe in thee. And when he had said these things, the Alemanni turned their backs and began to flee. When they saw that their king was killed, they submitted to the sway of Clovis, saying, Now we are thine. So Clovis very much was, was what they used to call a pagan, basically anyone who was not a Christian. And he had his own gods, but he had a wife who was a Christian. And so she was constantly trying to get him to become a Christian, but he didn't until he was fighting a battle and he was about to lose. And so he said, no, hey, if you, God of the Christians, Jesus Christ, if you help me win, then I will become a Christian. And they won. So true to his word, he did become a Christian. So not only did he become a Christian, that means that the people of his kingdom had to become Christians too. And there's other good reasons why he did it. And, well, uh, the other people in his kingdom, most of them already were Christians. And so by becoming a Christian, becoming a Catholic, he suddenly got the support of all the people uh, in Europe, because the Catholic Church had been converting all the people there. So most of the people were Christian, and so it was very advantageous for him to become a Christian as well. So here's the painting of the scene. Here is Clovis up on his horse. He's looking towards heaven, and as you can see, the battle is pretty rough. There's like dead people everywhere. He looks up to heaven, and God and the angels in heaven say, "Hey!" They hear his cry. They say, "Help me!" And they say, "Okay," and it allows him to win the battle. So this is a famous turning point in European history, because it marks when the king of the Franks converts to Christianity. And so it's not just the Romans, but the Franks who found the modern country of France becomes a Christian and converts. So we're going to be talking more about the influence of the Catholic Church, and it'll be very important to understand that. So Clovis's grandson, I think it was. No, sorry, great grandson or something. He about 300, well, 400 years later, Charlemagne unites all the Christian lands of Europe into a single empire. So he started, Clovis basically just controlled this northern part uh, of the territory, and under his sons, they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And under Charlemagne, he took over all of this. Charlemagne is French, of course, for Charles the Great, Charles Magne, and he unified all the Christian lands into a single empire. He was the king from 768 to 814, and he became a very powerful king because he had a powerful army. First off, he was a great warrior, and of course, but he was a really good general and could lead men. And he rewarded the knights, the soldiers who served him, right? The ones who were really good and served him really, really well. He would give them land. He would give them land, and so that's how you would get land. And as we talk about land, it's going to become super important because when it comes to owning something, when it comes to owning something, the only thing you could really own was land, and the king owned all the land, and so he would reward the soldiers with land and with privileges. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk more about what those privileges are. So because Charlemagne had conquered so much territory, and because Charlemagne was a Christian, the Roman Catholic Church, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, is the Pope, and the Pope is the formerly the Bishop of Rome, and so he is the most important leader, and he becomes the head of the entire Roman Catholic Church. Still is today. He goes over to Charlemagne and gives him a crown and says, "You are now the Holy Roman Emperor. You are the Holy Roman Emperor." And so this is we're trying to recreate the Roman Empire, which had fallen apart about 300 years ago. And so it's super important because Charlemagne, this is the first time that all the Christian territory in Western Europe was united under one king. It was the first time since the Roman Empire, had fallen apart, and there had been all this fighting in between. And so the Pope was hoping that Charlemagne could recreate the Roman Empire, so that you can have this massive empire where there would be peace with all the people, and the Roman Catholic Church, of course, would be the most powerful. Now, during this time, yes, Charlemagne had conquered all the territory, but there were other people continuing to attack, and there were still always people fighting to conquer. And from the north came the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, in their ships, we look at them with the horns on their helmets. They began attack from the north. The Magyars, which are people from the east, they they came in riding in from the eastern side and started an attack. And from the south, the warriors of Islam, Muslims. And we'll talk more about Islam and how it began, and how it became super, super powerful. Suffice it to say that the Islam began in the Middle East, in what we call the Arabian Peninsula, and expanded. And by this time, had conquered all of North Africa and Spain. Right? So Europe needed a way to defend itself after Charlemagne died. He was the strongest warrior, the best king there was. But after he died, uh, his three grandsons couldn't decide on who would be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and so they split the kingdom, each son taking a third. And so the kingdom was weaker already. So the system of feudalism was based on the need for protection. People needed to be protected from attacks, right? People in the north are getting attacked by Vikings, from the east, from Magyars, and Muslims from the south. And you needed protection because, if you're standing all by yourself and an army comes around and wants to steal all your stuff, basically they're going to steal all your stuff. You can fight against them, in which case you die, because there's, even if you're a good warrior, there's just you're all by yourself, right? And if you're trying to protect your family, well, yeah, the best thing to do is just run away, right? So you you need to find protection. You need to find other people to help protect you, and that's what feudalism is based on. So let's talk about all the people who are part of the medieval society. There are basically three types of people: oratores, those who pray; bellatores, those who fight; laborores, those who work. And that's, of course, from Latin. The oratores, those who pray, those are priests. They are the priests. Remember, there's only one church at this time, the Roman Catholic Church. Every town, every place has a church, and every church has a priest. And the priest, their job is to pray and to preach the gospel, to explain what Christianity means. And they were also the only people who could read, because they needed to learn to read the Bible. Everybody else, there wasn't really time for, only rich people could afford school, and so everybody else had to work, which is the laborers. They were most people had to work, and the only job, most important job, was that of farmer. Why? Because if you don't farm, you don't grow any food. If you don't grow any food, you don't eat. Right? There was a not as many stores because people had to work to grow food. It was growing. If you ever worked on a farm, growing food is really really difficult, and because they didn't have the technology that we have today, I mean, one person could probably grow enough food for two or three people, basically for one family, and so everybody had to basically work as a farmer, and that was pretty much the important job. But of course, you also need those who fight. Those who fight, they needed to protect from the farmers, so so the farmers would pay them to protect them. So fight those who fight would be the knights, and so we have a picture of a knight in armor, and we'll talk more about the knights uh, and how they would fight, and in a little bit. Feudal hierarchy. A hierarchy is a system of who's on top and who's on the bottom. Hierarchy is always a pyramid. There's always one person on the top and a whole bunch of people on the bottom. The person on the top, of course, is the king. He is the one, he owns all the land. That's the thing about the king. He owns all the land, he has all the power. Just below him, has a little bit more, uh, they have to obey the king, but everybody else has to obey them, are the nobles. The nobles are the people that the king rewards, the king's, uh, the important people who serve the king, and they support the king. And they are what we call nobility. And how do you become a noble? Well, first, if you have, helped the king out, the king will reward you, and he will give you land. And so you now, the king still owns the land, but he's given it to you, so you own it in the king's name, right? And so, how do you become a noble? Well, if you once you've done that, you can pass it on to your son. Right? You pass it on to your son, you pass it on to them, and he passes on to his son. So after helping out the king, the only way to become a noble is to be born one, because their father was a noble. The knights, just below them, are the soldiers who work for the nobles. They fight for the nobles, and the nobles uh, then fight for the king. So they are the protection. They are the actual army. And you need lots of knights because there's lots of other armies running around, fighting and trying to steal your stuff. And of course, at the very bottom is everybody else, which is most of society. Most of the people, like I said, have to work as farmers, and so that's what the peasants are. Peasants don't own the land; the nobles do, and the king gives it to them. So the peasants, how do you get any food? Well, you go to the noble, and the noble gives you a little piece of land, and you work on that land, and you give the noble some of the food that you grow. And or the noble puts all of the land in the same place, and all the peasants have to go work it, and then the noble will give some of the food to the peasants. All right, so it's all about loyalty and honor. So, like I said, the very top is the king, and he would give land and protection to the nobles. Okay, give land and protection to the nobles. The nobles would give land and protection to smaller nobles, to smaller ones, and they would give land and protection to knights, to the soldiers. They would give them a place to live. They'd give them food, and in return, the and the knights would protect them, and the knights would give land and protection to regular people. Right. So all the regular people would serve the knights, who would serve the lords, who would serve the powerful lords who serve the king. How do they serve them? They give them loyalty and military support. Loyalty means that they would obey whatever they say, right? And they would obey. You order to grow food, to work as a farmer, you do it. And when they need some military support, the peasants would grab their sticks, and if there was a battle, they grab their sticks and they go fight other peasants under the command of the knights. And the knights, they would have a little bit more money so that they would buy armor and swords, and so they would use their swords and armor to give loyalty and military support to the lords. the lesser lords, and the lesser lords would take their knights, and they would give loyalty and support to the powerful lords, the more important ones, and they of course would give loyalty and military support to the king, and on it goes. So this is the order in which it works. So let's talk about kings. Very, very top. Kings, also known as monarchs, believed in what we call the divine right of kings. Divine, anytime you see the word divine, that means from God. From God. And this is where religion becomes super important. If God chose you as the king, that means that you have to obey him, because if whatever the king tells you to do, if you disobey it, it's like you're disobeying God. And so you are, nobody wants to do that, because if you do that, then you're going to get kicked out of heaven when you die, and this is which is a terrible thing, right? So this is now. Did God really go down and choose the kings? Well, that's what the king said. The king said God said it, and who's gonna question them? Because whatever the king says is the law. Whatever the king says, you have to obey, or else he's gonna kick you out. So what did the kings do? They give fiefs to their vassals. A fief is another name for land. They would give land to the people who helped them. And so these were called vassals. A vassal is somebody who works for the king and gives them the support, and in return the king gives them land or a fief. So basically it would be like if the soldier fought for the king, and the king gives him San Francisco. It'd be a huge area of land, and everyone who lives there now has to work and support the lord, okay, the vassal. So the most important quality of feudalism is loyalty. You have to obey. You have to be loyal to your vassal, and the vassal has to be loyal to the king. So in the feudal hierarchy, they have all these kind of these names for the things, and you might see them even today. There's the duke, there's the lord, there's the lady, there's the viscount, and these are all their actual orders. And it's not that important that you know that the actual order, only to know that these are all what we call nobility. And the way you get your nobility is either by become a servant of the king or be born with it. So this whole system of feudalism spread to England, which is England, the British Isles, by William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was the Norman king who crossed the English Channel and defeated the Angles at the Battle of Hastings in the year 1066. That's also significant because the year 1066 was the last time England was successfully invaded. Right? So England's an old country, and it has never been invaded successfully since 1066. So that's a pretty significant thing, right? This picture we know about this is what we call the Bayeux Tapestry. It is a tapestry is basically a long kind of a painting done on cloth, and this cloth is about it's the size of several rooms. It's a big long strip, and it tells the story of how of the Battle of Hastings. All right, so let's talk about castles. Castles, of course, the stone, the walls, the really tall towers. It's one of those things that people really love to talk about. I love to talk about castles, and I like to go and visit castles. I've gone to Europe a couple times. This particular picture is of a castle I visited, and I love going to see castles and to explore what they are. And we'll talk more about castles. So, lords and ladies during feudal times. The nobles, which are the lords and ladies, the dukes, the duchesses, all of them, they were given land by the king, and they had to protect that land, and so they had to go live there, and they built a house, and that's what a castle is, right? They are called manors, and a basically a castle is just a gigantic house. Now, in the times of war, these houses had to be protected, so they would build them with great walls and even moats. Moats, of course, water that surrounds the castle, and that's one of the ways of protecting the castle because in order to attack it, you had to get across the moat. And it's not, in cartoons and stuff, you see the moats are full of like alligators and stuff. In real life, Europe is too cold for alligators. Well, it didn't really happen. Now, it is the Lord's responsibility. It was given the land by the king, and he is his job. He can grow whatever he wants on it, and he has to give some of it back to the king. So he has to manage and defend the manor. He has to protect it because if he needs people to work as farmers for him, and people are not going to do that unless he gives them protection. He also is basically the government for that particular fief, for that particular area. So he gets if people have any problems, they come to him. Acts as the judge. The Lord's wife, the lady, was responsible for raising and training the children, seeing the household, which means running things, making sure that there's enough food on the table, making sure that the dinner is made, making sure that clothes are clean, making sure that people are paid, and the servants, and organizing the servants and all that. So that's what the lords and the ladies had to do. It was actually pretty prescribed, which means that they had rules that they had to live by, and they kind of had to obey those rules, even if they didn't want to. Here's an example of the rules. Marriage. When we think about marriages, people get married because they love each other. That didn't happen. That really wasn't why they did there. Okay, marriages are usually to gain land or property. How do you gain land or property through the marriage? Well, if a family owns some property, then of course the kids are going to get that property when the parents die. And marriages back then were arranged by parents. That means that the parents would get together and they said, okay, you have a son, I have a daughter, and I think that they could get married, right? And so they would arrange these marriages. Sometimes the kids were only 4 or 5 years old when the marriage happened. And of course, when you're that young, you don't really know what happens. You don't really know what's going on, and you obviously don't have a chance to say yes or no. And so you had to, this was the rules that you had to live by. The bride's family, the girl's family, would pay a dowry. A dowry is, well, money, right? That the bride's family would give to the groom, to the man, and they're supposed to use that to set up the kingdom that they have, and that allowed them to live, right. uh, Now if you were poor, then it was much much harder to get married because rich people would marry other rich people. And if you never got married, nobody was you couldn't provide a big enough dowry. Sometimes, a lot of times, you're forced into a convent. Those of you who are Catholic know about nuns. Nuns are the female version of priests, and they aren't allowed to get married, so they are kind of stuck, and so they're stuck with all the other nuns. And it's not that necessarily that they totally believe, but they needed a place to go, and so they were forced to become nuns. Women and children were property of the husband and father. Right, the man's was the one in charge, and whatever he said goes. He's the leader. He makes the decisions. Certain days, the wife was required to lie at the husband's feet and beg forgiveness for anything she had done, and the children would do the same thing, right, or fail to do. And so, unfortunately, this is not a good way of having a marriage or running a society. And it does lead to violence, right? Uh, Child and wife beatings were common. That means it happened a lot. Although there were rules which said the beating should be reasonable, It should match whatever the wife, whatever the wife messed up with. Okay? So women didn't have any rights basically at this time. Right? So they didn't have the right to say what they want. And they didn't even have the right to own property. So whatever property they own belonged to the husband, and the husband can do whatever they wanted to with it. Knights, of course, are armored soldiers. Then mounted armored soldiers. Mounted means that you ride a horse. Right? So they also had rules that they had to live by. The code of chivalry. Chivalry is that knights are supposed to be pure of heart, that they're supposed to be good, that they are supposed to treat people uh, who are not as important as them with kindness, and to those the weaker people, you should not mistreat them, and you shouldn't beat them up and that kind of thing. How do you become a knight? At around age 7, you would start training. You'd start training by becoming what's called a squire. A squire is the assistant to a knight, and he would carry the knight's armor. He'd polish the knight's armor. He would fix the knight's armor. All in training so that he could become a knight one day. And the peasants. The peasants, of course, are everybody else. They did just about all the work, but they weren't allowed to own anything. They were, if they're lucky, they had the clothes on their back, and most of them were what we call farmers. Farmers, of course, like I said, one person could grow enough food for maybe 2, 3, maybe if they worked really hard, maybe 4 or 5, just enough for basically one family. So everybody had to work. Everybody had to be farmers. A serf is a type of peasant that is tied to the land. Right? That means that it's kind of like a slave. You're owned by the noble, by the lord and the lady. And so if the lord sells the land to another lord, the serfs go with them. They didn't have a choice about who they served. They belonged to the land. So the vast majority of people were peasants. So that's what medieval society was made up of. All right, so that concludes our video lecture on this medieval society.